Although it's pretty difficult to implement this feed, it's actually really easy to test. So we're going to write a test first. And because the feed is attached to the user model, it'll go in the user test file. So that's this. We can put it here. And let's remind ourselves of what the data looks like. Actually, let's do this. We want users.yaml. And we also want to look at the microposts. And finally, look at the relationships. So let's pull out some of these users here. I'm going to pull out the first three in variables. This is Michael, Archer, and Lana. And so the feed should certainly include the post from a followed user. So let's look over here in the relationships. Let's start with Michael, who's following Lana. So let's say this is test for post from a followed user. So each of Lana's microposts, which we can see here, there are two of them, should appear in Michael's feed. Let's say this is post from the following list, from user.following. We're going to assert that Michael's feed, so remember in the user model, we have this feed. It's just the proto feed right now. But we've got this feed, so we're going to say assert michael.feed.include this post, so post following. And we also want the feed to include the user's own micropost, so that's post from self. So michael.micropost.each do post self, and this is the same assertion. Michael.feed include post self. And finally, we want post from an unfollowed user not to appear in the feed. So in this case, if you look at the relationships, Michael is following Lana and Mallory, but not Archer. Archer is following Michael, but Michael is not following Archer. So if we say archer.micropost, iterate over these microposts. This is post from an unfollowed user. Assert not michael.feed include post unfollowed. Save that. Let's see, we should be definitely red. Some of these will pass, right? Because right now, these will pass. These assertions will pass. But this test will fail overall because Lana's microposts don't appear. So actually, both of these are passing now. These are here mainly so that if we make any errors in our feed implementation, this will catch those mistakes. So what's failing right now is these microposts, and then these are here just as a safety net. All right, we're ready now to start with the implementation. And I mentioned in the last lesson that we did micropost.where instead of just returning microposts, because this will generalize more naturally to the full feed. And we're going to put that into practice right now. Let's take a look at a guess of the kind of SQL you might be looking for. Just going to put this in the Scratch area. So we're going to issue a select. We're going to select all microposts, so select all elements from microposts, where the user ID is in a list of IDs of the users being followed, or, actually it should be caps, just conventionally, or the user ID is equal to the current user's ID. In writing this, we're hoping that SQL supports something like this in keyword for set inclusion, and in fact it does. And remember, we're using the terminology following, so this is really the IDs of the users in the following list. So we expect something like this. I think something like this might work. So we need to make a list of the following IDs. Let me show you some ways to do that. Actually, let's go here to this console. Recall that we can use the map method like this. We can map over a list. I'm going to call 2s on each of these integers. Gives me an array of strings. We also saw there was a shorthand for this in lesson 4, so we can do map ampersand colon 2s. That just applies 2s to each element. And we can also join these, say on comma space. So it turns out this is exactly the form that we need for these following IDs. So we can do something like this, user.first. Let's just look at one of the users. Pull out all the following. These are all the users being followed. Just pull them out initially. So if we call .map colon ID here, that's just all the IDs of those users being followed. And this is exactly the list of IDs that we want for something like this. So we're thinking that maybe we'll have where user ID in followed IDs. So the way to do that is with this escaping we saw before. We want something like this, following IDs. This isn't going to work though, right? Because we need to build up this array. Except that this is so useful, Rails actually supplies it by default. User.first.following IDs. So in fact, all of that work was unnecessary. And this actually does have the following IDs. So if we save this, we'll get one step closer to passing. You can see the problem here is that in the query, we've got user ID in just raw IDs, but they actually need to be inside of parens. So let's do this. Now we've only got one failure, line 97, so it's here. So now it's just the post from self, and that's right. We need this here, this or user ID equals the user's ID. So we can say user ID in following IDs, or user ID equals question mark and then user.id. This won't work actually. I mean, it's pretty obvious it won't work if you think about it. Right, undefined local variable or method user. That's because this is really self. This is also self here. Let me just put it in. Right, over here we had, this is user.following IDs. This is just a user.first. So if we save this though, we're actually green. Right? This is a working feed. Get rid of the self dot. So this is just our best attempt at trying to think what kind of SQL query might work. And this actually built a working feed. In fact, in some applications, this implementation might be good enough. But it's not quite good enough for a site that gets any sort of real users. So before fixing that, see if you can figure out why. I'll give you a hint. What if a user is following 5,000 other users?